Hi, this is Ruth with Simply Sustainable Family, and today I would like to talk about some of the most common gardening mistakes that no one seems to talk about. And the reason I've stumbled onto these is because I've made every single one myself at some point. Some of them multiple times before I finally figured out what was actually going on, but that's beside the point. So anyway, the first one I would like to talk about is planting too early. And this is something that you may not run into depending on where in the country you live. Like, I know when I used to live in Missouri, this wasn't nearly as big of an issue because we could plant as early as March often and not have a problem. But now that I live in Maine, the planting season can sometimes start in May for certain crops like peas and radishes and some of the greens, but for the most part, you don't really want to put anything into the ground until that first week of June. And I did not follow this one year. There was one year that we'd had insanely warm weather for Maine all the way through the month of May. Very warm, no frost at all. And so I decided that I was fine to go ahead and put everything in the ground. So the last Sunday of May, I put out all of my seedlings, everything that I'd bought, everything that I'd started myself from seed. I put it all into the ground, watered it, thought I was good to go. Got up the next morning and discovered that we'd had an unexpected and unpredicted frost that had killed everything. So it ended up, like, obviously that was extremely frustrating and disappointing, and I had to start all over again. But the funniest part, well, not very funny, but the funniest part of the whole thing was that I had planted a bunch of peppers, which died. So I went back because I didn't have time to restart anything myself. So I went to one of the local nurseries and bought a bunch more pepper plants and replanted them and watched them grow all summer and took care of them and watered them and everything else. And then we got to September and I was excited. I got my first pepper off. We ate it for dinner that night. And then we had an early fall frost and I lost everything again. So needless to say, that was probably the most expensive vegetable I have ever eaten, was that one single pepper off of 2 rounds of pepper seedlings. So yes, whatever the growing season is for your area, whatever the recommended wait till you plant date is, follow it, because one of the years it will bite you and it's not any fun. So that extra week is just, it's not worth fighting it. So now I am, no matter how warm it is, no matter how nice it is, no matter how few frosts we've had, I wait until the first week of June before I put anything that's cold sensitive into the ground. So the next one I'd like to talk about is your soil's pH. So this doesn't always have to be a big issue depending on your soil. And a lot of times your soil can go with not great pH for many years without it really being a problem. But there are definitely ideal pHs depending on what crops that you want to grow. For example, blueberries, as most people know, can grow in very acidic soil, even below an acidity level of 5. But 5 would kill most of your, regular garden plants. So just keep in mind an average pH that you're looking for your soil. You can buy a soil tester on Amazon for very inexpensive, less than $20, that gives you an estimated pH for your soil. And, just kind of go with that. The main issue that I had with pH was not necessarily an issue with having the crops grow well, but was more of a weed problem. So when we first started this garden, when we started our homestead back in 2018, we tilled everything up, we put manure in it, I did not put any lime. And that year I had the most massive thistle issue. It was awful. Like, any bare spot in my garden that did not actually have a garden plant growing in it was just covered in these huge thistles. It was carpeted. So thistles are something that enjoy more of an acidic soil, and the manure does bring acidity to the soil. So if you are using manure as your main fertilizer, it is good at least, once a year, maybe every other year, just to add some lime as you prepare your garden. And since I started doing that, my thistle problem was probably cut in half the first year and then has become steadily better with every progressing year. So yeah, just, keep in mind that that may be part of your issue if you're having one consistent weed that just will not go away no matter what you do to it. So the third and fourth common gardening mistakes that I want to talk about are planting too deep and planting too shallow. And planting too deep is something that I did for probably 2 or 3 years in a row before I finally realized what I was doing. Whenever you buy a seed packet, whether it's from one of the organic catalogs or you pick it up at your local hardware store, they all have a recommended planting depth on the back of the packet. And when I first started gardening, I thought that that was kind of like people think of speed limits, like you can follow it if you want to, but it's not really that big of a deal. It is a big deal. So I went for 3 years with having this big bare spot in my garden because all of my stuff with real small seeds that wanted a like 1/4 inch of soil coverage, I was doing more like a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, and it was too much and too heavy for the seeds, and they weren't sprouting. So I had a lot of problems with growing cabbages, carrots, leeks, Brussels sprouts, all of those little tiny seeds like that. There was one year I didn't have any cabbage, any Brussels sprout, or any leek come up at all. And as soon as I remedied that and started actually following the recommended planting depth for those vegetables, it's been no problem since then. So the same goes with planting too shallow. I ran into that after I stopped planting too deep. Then I was paranoid about, planting everything too deep. So the recommended planting depth for peas is usually 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch. And I planted my peas at probably about a 1/2 inch depth. And everything that wasn't right up against my house ended up being eaten by the crows because it was way too close to the surface. So yes, all of that to say, if there's a recommended planting depth on the package of your seeds, just for everybody's peace of mind, try to follow it as closely as possible. No, you do not need to be out in the garden with a measuring stick trying to get it exact, but just try to follow it as closely as possible and it'll be okay. And if you are doing some of the seeds that are real tiny and you're just, you have some heavy soil and you're really struggling with putting them in too deep, use a rake. It's a lot easier to bury seeds shallow if you're just kind of raking them in, almost like you would maybe rake in grass seed. So a hoe it's real easy to just grab a big clump of dirt and scrape it over, and the rake is easier to control the amount of seed coverage that you're getting. Next, I would like to talk about weeds and pests, and don't let either one get ahead of you. So if you have the time at all in your day, just try to take a quick walk through your garden at least once a day. It will pay off hugely, because if you do start to get beetle infestation, caterpillars, voles starting to gnaw on things, deer coming in and munching on your broccoli, whatever the case may be, it is so much easier to catch it immediately and take care of it immediately before you lose everything. And that quick walk through the garden, flip over a few leaves, check each row as briefly as possible, but just cast your eye over everything basically. And that will help tremendously with the pests, because if you can get on, even if they've started into things, if you can get on top of it immediately, then a lot of times you can get them to go away before the damage is irreparable. And as far as weeds, this is probably one of my more embarrassing gardening mistakes. So there was one of the years when I first started gardening, and I'll use the excuse that I was pregnant, because I was huge pregnant in the middle of the summer, and I was tired and I was hot and I didn't want to be out in my garden as much as I normally do. So instead of staying on top of the weeds, I let them get away with me. And by the time I started weeding on a consistent basis and, hoeing up the weeds were probably about, 6 to 8 inches tall, which is pretty tall for a garden to begin with. Well, I have a massive garden and I was huge pregnant, so I could only be out in the heat for, a certain amount of time before I needed to go inside and take a break. So it took me a long time to make it all the way across all of my gardens. by the time I finished, the last row that I was doing was over 2 feet tall, and it was preventing a lot of my garden plants from actually getting sun and water and everything else the way that they were supposed to. So weeding is, again, one of those things. It's really not that big of a deal, especially if you've got a good sharp hoe. It's a pretty quick job. Just stay on top of it. It's so much easier. So like pretty much as soon as stuff pops up in the garden and you know where your rows are at and that you're not going to accidentally hoe up any of your seeds, then go out and just kind of, rake the row in between the rows with your hoe, catch any of the big stuff that you see, and just stay on top of it. I mean, it takes 10-15 minutes a day at the most, as long as you do it consistently. And then once your seedlings are taller than the weeds, then you can slow it down a little bit, because the weeds do help with the ground coverage. It helps to hold moisture in so you don't have to water as much and all of that kind of stuff. So your ground in between your rows doesn't have to be completely bare. But definitely while your seedlings are getting established, it's important to stay on top of the weeds and then, keep up with them to a moderate amount for the rest of the year. So my 7th common gardening mistake that I want to talk about is waiting too long to harvest. And this is a tough one, because a lot of times things in the garden are all coming off together and you can't possibly keep up with it all at once. There's only so many pickles and jams and tomato sauces that you can make in a single day when it's all coming off together. But if you do have crops, the root crops are big ones for this. Like if you have beets or carrots or something like that that are ready for harvest, try not to leave them sitting in the ground. The voles love root vegetables, and I have lost so many turnips, beets, carrots, all that type of stuff over the years, because I saw that they were ready to harvest and I was busy and focused on doing something else, and I waited 2 or 3 days to do it, and by the time I got back to it just 2 or 3 days later, the voles had been at them, and I've lost up to 70% of a single crop in a given year just because of that. And then whatever they do leave mostly intact has usually at least had the top knot on a little bit, so then you're trying to cut it off before you wash it, and it's a mess. So if you can at all, just try to stagger your harvest to where you're taking the stuff off immediately as soon as it's ready, and it ends up working out better, and everything's fresher, everything has a greater nutrition content when it's being taken off at the right time, nothing's getting woody, hard, flavorless, and you actually get your whole harvest instead of sharing it with field mice that you were not really caring to feed. My last common gardening mistake isn't necessarily about your garden, it's more about yourself and your own health, but don't let yourself get overheated. I am notorious for this. I'm very one-minded, very focused when I get going on something, and my husband will tell you that I'm really bad about coming out to the garden without water and not paying attention to how hot I'm getting, and he'll finally come out after a couple of hours and be like, hey honey, you're looking kind of red, which is his way of telling me that I need to get inside and get some water. So don't do that. I have ended up being more sick and more nauseous from doing that than anything else. And it's very easy to just keep some water out in the garden with you. A lot of times I find that I feel much better and I get so much more done if I just set myself a timer, and every hour I come back to the house, I sit on my porch swing and swing for a few minutes and drink some water, cool down, go use the restroom, all of that fun stuff, and then go out and get started again. And especially on the really sunny days, a hat will save you so much. Like, it's amazing how much just keeping the heat off of your head and face will do for making you feel better. Hopefully you have enjoyed these 8 common gardening mistakes that no one seems to talk about, but all of us, I think, have made them at some point or another. So if you have any questions, definitely post them below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and go ahead and hit subscribe. I try to post new content every Monday and sometimes a bonus. So take care, guys. Thanks.